I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. Not until that weekend in the woods. It was October, and my friends and I decided to rent a cabin for a few days. We wanted to escape the city, enjoy the fall colors, and maybe tell a few campfire stories. Little did we know we'd become the story. The cabin was old, tucked deep into the forest, miles from the nearest town. The owner, an elderly man with a gravelly voice, handed us the keys and warned us, "Don't go into the basement. It's locked for a reason." We laughed it off, thinking it was just some quirky advice to scare city folks like us. The first night was peaceful. We roasted marshmallows, told jokes, and enjoyed the crisp air. But as the sun set, the woods grew eerily quiet. No crickets, no owls, just silence. That's when we heard it. A faint knocking sound, like someone tapping on glass. We searched the cabin but found nothing. The next morning, Jake discovered something strange. The basement door, which had been locked the day before, was slightly ajar. The lock was broken, as if someone, or something, had forced it open. Against the owner's warning, we decided to check it out. The basement was damp and dark, with a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air smelled like mildew and something metallic. In the corner, we found an old, rusted cage. Inside it were strange symbols carved into the walls and a pile of bones. Animal bones, we hoped. That night, things took a turn for the worse. Sarah woke up screaming, claiming she saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. Jake brushed it off as a nightmare, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around 3 a.m., the knocking returned, louder this time. It was coming from the basement. We grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs, determined to find the source. The basement was freezing, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us. As we approached the cage, the flashlight flickered. That's when we saw it. A pair of glowing eyes staring back at us from the darkness. We froze. The eyes moved closer, and the knocking turned into a deafening bang, like something was trying to break free. We ran upstairs, locked the basement door, and packed our things. But as we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. In the upstairs window, I swear I saw a figure watching us. Its face pale and twisted into a smile. We never went back. Later, I did some research and found out the cabin had a dark history. Decades ago, a family had lived there. The father, a recluse, kept his daughter locked in the basement. She died down there, and he disappeared soon after. To this day, I can't explain what we saw or heard. But one thing's for sure. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some places, they're better left forgotten. Last year, I went on a solo hiking trip in a remote part of the forest. I wanted to disconnect from the world and spend a few days in nature. I packed light, just a tent, some food, and basic supplies. But on the second day, I got lost. My map was useless, and my phone had no signal. As the sun began to set, I stumbled upon an old cabin deep in the woods. It looked abandoned, with broken windows and a sagging roof. Desperate for shelter, I decided to check it out. The door creaked open, and the inside was dark and musty. There was a dusty table, a rusty stove, and a single chair. It wasn't much, but it was better than sleeping outside. I lit a candle and settled in for the night. Everything seemed fine until I heard it, a faint knocking sound, like someone tapping on the door. My heart raced. I grabbed my knife and called out, "Who's there?" No one answered. I opened the door, but there was no one outside. The forest was eerily quiet. I told myself it was just an animal or the wind and went back inside. But the knocking returned, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the walls. I searched the cabin but found nothing. The knocking stopped, and I tried to calm myself down. That's when I noticed something strange. The chair by the table had moved. I was sure it had been in the corner when I arrived. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. Behind it, I found an old, overgrown trail. Following it, I stumbled upon a small, crumbling shed. Inside, there were rusty tools, a pile of empty food cans, and a sleeping bag. Someone had been living here. Recently, I felt a chill run down my spine. Was someone watching me? I hurried back to the cabin, packed my things, and decided to leave. But as I stepped outside, I saw fresh footprints in the mud. They led away from the cabin and into the woods. I followed the footprints, hoping they would lead me back to the main trail. Instead, they led me to a shallow grave. The dirt looked freshly dug, and there was a broken watch lying on top. My stomach turned. I didn't want to know what or who was buried there. I ran back to the cabin, grabbed my backpack, and started walking in the opposite direction. I didn't care if I got lost. I just wanted to get away from that place. After hours of walking, I finally found a road and flagged down a passing car. I never told anyone about the cabin or the grave. I still don't know who lived there or what happened in those woods. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the knocking on the walls and the footprints in the mud. And I wonder if whoever was in that cabin is still out there, waiting for the next lost hiker to stumble upon their hiding place. It was the winter of 2021, and I had made up my mind. I needed a break from everything. Work was stressful, family responsibilities were piling up, and the constant noise of the city was exhausting. I wanted some peace and quiet, so I decided to go winter camping alone. I chose a remote area in the Colorado Rockies, a place I had visited once before in the summer. Back then, it had been calm, beautiful, and untouched. I thought it would be the perfect escape. What I didn't know was that this trip would turn into something I would never forget. I reached the trailhead late in the afternoon. The sky was covered in thick gray clouds, and the freezing air bit at my skin. I strapped on my heavy backpack, filled with all the supplies I thought I would need, and started the long hike toward an old abandoned cabin I remembered from my last visit. It was nothing fancy, just a small wooden structure with a stone fireplace. But it was sturdy enough to keep me warm and dry. The hike took about 2 hours, and with every step, the cold seemed to get worse. The snow was deep, making it harder to walk, and the silence around me felt almost unnatural. By the time I finally reached the cabin, the sun had already disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the forest in complete darkness. The only sound was the crunch of snow under my boots. I pushed open the creaky wooden door and stepped inside. The cabin looked exactly the same as before, dusty, freezing cold, but strong. I wasted no time and got to work. I started a fire in the fireplace. I laid out my sleeping bag on the wooden floor, then pulled out my portable stove to cook a simple meal. The warmth, the silence, and the isolation were exactly what I had wanted. Everything felt peaceful. But as the night went on, that peaceful feeling slowly started to disappear. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint knocking sound. At first, it was so soft that I almost ignored it, like the gentle tapping of a tree branch against wood. But there were no branches close to the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding. The cabin had no windows, only small gaps between the wooden planks. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal. Then the knocking grew louder, more forceful, more deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam around the cabin's interior. Empty. I turned toward the door, pulse hammering in my ears. The knocking stopped. My breath came in shaky gasps as I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But just as I started to relax, it came again. This time, from the door. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. My fingers trembled as I gripped the flashlight tighter. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to speak. "Who's there?" Silence. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, pressing against me. My instincts screamed at me to stay put, to leave the door shut. But what if it was a lost hiker? Someone in trouble? Slowly, I unlatched the door, heart hammering against my ribs. I cracked it open just enough to peer outside. The icy wind bit at my face, but I barely noticed. My eyes scanned the snow-covered ground. Nothing. The snow was untouched. No footprints, no sign of movement. The forest stood still, the tall trees like silent figures in the moonlight. My stomach twisted with unease. If no one was there, who or what had been knocking? I shut the door quickly, locking it tight. My pulse was racing, but I told myself to calm down. Maybe it was just falling ice, or a branch swaying in the wind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Then the knocking started again. This time, it moved. First on one wall, then another. A slow, deliberate sound, as if something was circling the cabin. My chest tightened. Whatever it wasn't leaving. I buried myself in my sleeping bag, covering my ears, trying to block it out. But then I heard something worse. A growl. Low, guttural, and deep. It came from just outside the door. My whole body tensed. It wasn't the sound of any animal I had ever heard before. It was something else. Something wrong. The growl grew louder, followed by the sound of scratching. Long, sharp claws dragging across the wood. The door shook. The latch rattled. My heart slammed against my ribs. I gripped my knife so tightly my hand ached. My eyes locked on the door, watching, waiting. The scratching grew more violent. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped in my own fear. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. The only sound was the faint crackling of the fire. The door stood still. No more knocking. No more growling. Whatever had been out there was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, listening, waiting for the nightmare to return. But the cabin remained quiet. When the first light of dawn slipped through the cracks in the walls, I didn't waste a second. I packed my gear as fast as I could and left without looking back. The hike back to my car was a blur. My mind kept replaying the sounds, the shaking door, the feeling of something watching me. When I finally reached the trailhead, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Relief washed over me. But as I loaded my gear into the car, something caught my eye. The snow around the cabin's door was disturbed, but there were no footprints, only deep, claw-like marks leading off into the forest. I didn't stay to find out what had made them. I got in my car and drove away, vowing never to return to that place. To this day, I don't know what was out there that night. A wild animal? A cruel prank? Or something else? Something I don't even want to imagine? I may never know the answer, but I do know one thing. I will never go winter camping alone again.